when the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger roll, Discovery.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the November 21, 2018 edition of Space News. Once again, Peter Aylward with you, and we've got Michael Abdullah and Angelo De Grazia from the Space Association of Australia. Gentlemen, it's good to have you back.
Good to be back, Peter. How are you going?
Great.
G'day, Pete. G'day, Mike. And hello, world.
All right, well, we're going to start off again in Australia with all the space news happening in Australia. Well, kind of in Australia. The Australian Space Agency has welcomed the passage of a bipartisan US-Australia space cooperation resolution in the US. The US House of Representatives Resolution 1052 recognises the importance of the new Australian Space Agency, highlighting the value of US cooperation and encouraging continued international cooperation in space. Specifically, the resolution affirms the United States-Australia space exploration, research and utilisation cooperation, and encourages the United States Department of State to facilitate international cooperation through pre-existing diplomatic channels. One of the resolution's co-authors, Representative Joaquin Castro, Democrat of Texas, welcomed its passage by declaring, "As Australia opened its first space agency, we must seize the opportunity to collaborate on manned and unmanned exploration, research across our universities on astrophysics and other issues, and the development of commercial options to access space." So it looks like the Australian Space Agency continues to kick goals in the international space sector. Let's hope this translates to real opportunities for the industry domestically. And just across the Dutch, Rocket Lab announced last week that it has raised another $140 million in funding with an Australian connection. The announcement came just days after the company's successful first commercial launch of its Electron rocket, named its Business Time. The Series E round was led by Future Fund, Australia's sovereign wealth fund, with several other existing investors participating. Rocket Lab has now raised more than $288 million to date, and the company said this round values the company higher than the $1 billion plus valuation of its previous funding round of March 2017. The company plans to use the funding to expand its capabilities to meet a goal of weekly launches, while also investing in 3 unspecified research and development projects. Fascinating. Angelo, what's happening over stateside?
Okay, to the United States, US space policy. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said last week that the defeat of a key appropriator in recent elections and budget-cutting exercises were concerns for him. Bridenstine, speaking at a meeting of the National Space Council's Users Advisory Group, lamented the re-election defeat of Representative John Culberson, Republican Texas, chairman of the House Appropriations Subcommittee that funds NASA. Culberson's departure is of concern to me personally because of the support he provided NASA, Bridenstine said. He also mentioned budget exercises requested by the White House for all federal agencies, asking them to propose 5% cuts in their budgets. If such a cut were to go through, Bridenstine warned, we're not going to have what we need to go to the moon. Sad news indeed. Moving on, the big news this week. A National Space Council advisory group is sceptical of NASA's lunar exploration plans. NASA plans to return humans to the surface of the moon within 10 years, got a chilly reception from an advisory group last week, which called on the agency to accelerate that timeframe and reconsider development of the Gateway facility in lunar orbit. A meeting of the National Space Council's Users Advisory Group at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. was provided with an overview of the NASA exploration campaign, the high-level approach it plans to undertake to implement the President's Space Policy Directive No. 1. That campaign involves development of the Lunar Gateway, featuring modules from NASA as well as international and commercial partners, and plans to develop human-scale landers, starting with a descent stage that could be tested at the moon as soon as 2024. However, some committee members criticised the plan as not being ambitious enough. Personally, I think 2028 for humans on the moon, that's 10 years from now, just seems like so far off, said former astronaut and Space Shuttle Commander Eileen Collins. We can do it sooner, she said. This comes across as having no sense of urgency, said Harrison Schmitt, the Apollo 17 astronaut. The pace of the proposed program, Schmitt went on to say, didn't match what took place under Apollo. I think of launching Saturn V's every 2 months, and you're barely going to launch them every 2 years, he said of the Space Launch System. Very critical indeed. Others took issue with the development of the Gateway itself. I'm quite opposed to the Gateway, said Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin. Using the Gateway as a staging area for robotic or human missions to the lunar surface is absurd. Why would you want to send a crew to an intermediate point in space, pick up a lander there and go down to the surface, he argued. Aldrin said he liked the Moon Direct concept proposed by Robert Zubrin, the engineer best known for his advocacy of Mars missions that involves lunar landers travelling from Earth orbit to the lunar surface and back. He added he had similar ideas, although not as polished yet as Zubrin's. The former NASA Administrator Mike Griffin, attending the meeting in his capacity as Under Secretary of Defence for Research and Engineering, was asked about his views regarding the Gateway and a 2028 goal for humans on the surface of the moon. I think 2028 is so late as not even to be worthy of being on the table, he said. Such a date does not demonstrate that the United States is leader in anything. The architecture that has been put in play, putting a gateway before boots on the moon, is, from a space system engineer's point of view, a stupid architecture, he said, arguing instead to move with all deliberate speed to go back to the moon and access its resources. Gateway is useful when, but not before, they're manufacturing propellant on the moon and shipping it up to a depot in lunar orbit, he said. Griffin went on to raise the spectre of China getting humans to the moon before NASA can achieve a return to the lunar surface. My opinion is, if the Chinese wanted to do it, they could pretty easily be on the moon within the 6, 7, 8 years, no problem, he said. Wow. Mike.
Okay, moving on to the European Space Agency. ESA is planning a 2021 test flight of a spaceplane. The head of ESA Space Transportation Strategy and Policy said at a conference last week that the agency is planning to perform a qualification flight of its Space Rider vehicle in 2021. Space Rider, based on the intermediate experimental vehicle that flew in 2015, will be able to carry up to 800 kilograms of payload for orbital missions lasting as long as 2 months before returning to Earth. ESA will follow the qualification flight by a number of demonstration missions before transferring the program to industry. ESA hopes the vehicle attracts interest from those who want to perform short-duration microgravity science missions. Meanwhile, ESA is also developing an Earth observation spacecraft equipped with artificial intelligence. The BrainSat spacecraft would use AI to decide what images to take and what data to send to the ground. The experimental satellite is scheduled for launch next year. ESA also hopes it can demonstrate technologies to better deal with the huge volume of data, currently 150 terabytes a day, that the agency's Earth observation satellite collects. Peter.
All right, over to Russia. The Soyuz spacecraft to be used on the next mission to the International Space Station has passed a key test. Russian officials said the Soyuz MS-11 spacecraft passed a vacuum test with no signs of leaks. The Soyuz MS-9 spacecraft, currently docked to the International Space Station, suffered a leak in August, the cause of which remains under investigation, but could be linked to workmanship and handling issues during pre-launch or it's even been speculated by an American astronaut with a drill. All right, in other Russian news, the Russian RD-180 engines could find a new life on a proposed heavy lift rocket. Energomesh CEO Igor Arbuzov said the RD-180 engine built by his company could be used on the second stage of a future heavy lift rocket, but one unlikely to fly before the late 2020s. The engine could also be considered for a modernised version of the Soyuz 2 rocket. You'll recall that United Launch Alliance's Atlas V currently uses the RD-180, but that vehicle will be phased out during the first half of the 2020s as the company introduces its Vulcan rocket powered by Blue Origin's BE-4 rocket engine. Mike, China.
Okay, China has unveiled a design of a new heavy lift rocket intended to support human missions beyond Earth orbit. A model of the unnamed vehicle was on display at a Chinese air show earlier this month. The vehicle, being designed by the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology, could place 70 metric tons into low Earth orbit and 25 metric tons on a trans-lunar injection trajectory. Also on display was a scale model of the return capsule for a next-generation crewed spacecraft, which will perform an uncrewed test flight next year and ultimately replace the Shenzhou spacecraft. Let's look at India. The success of a satellite launch last week is an important milestone for India's exploration plans. The GSLV Mark III, which launched the GSAT-29 communications satellite, is next scheduled to launch India's Chandrayaan-2 mission to the Moon, which carries the country's first lunar lander and rover. India is also planning to use that vehicle for its human spaceflight program, which seeks to place humans in orbit by 2022.
Okay, let's talk general commercial space. SpaceX and 3 other companies won FCC approval for new satellite constellations last week. The FCC approved SpaceX's proposal for a constellation of 7,518, yes, you heard that correctly, V-band satellites in very low Earth orbit, the largest of 4. The reason they are in a very low orbit is that they don't last that long and they can actually re-enter and reduce space debris, so that's a good thing. The FCC also granted approvals to Telsat for a new 117 satellite V-band system, Kepler Communications for a 140 satellite Ku-band system, and LeoSat for a 78 satellite Ka-band system. All the companies now have 6 years to launch at least half their satellites and 9 years to deploy all of them. Moving to SpaceX. SpaceX launched a Qatari communications satellite last week, tying a record for the most launches by the company in a year. The Falcon 9 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida and deployed the SHale-2 satellite into a geostationary transfer orbit 32 minutes later. The satellite, built by Mitsubishi for Qatari operator SHale-Sat, carries Ku-band capacity for television broadcasting and Ka-band capacity for connectivity to businesses and government users. The rocket's first stage had previously launched the Telstar 19 satellite in July. The launch was the 18th this year for SpaceX, tying a record set last year, with 4 more launches scheduled through to the end of the year. Just to keep an eye out for the next launch, it will use a flight-proven booster for the 3rd time. This is the first time an orbital-class booster will have been used 3 times. So that'll be something to see. Peter?
Sure will be. All right, well, finally this week, some Virgin Orbit news. They say they're one step closer to their first test flight. The company said last week that it performed high-speed taxi tests at a California airport of its 747 carrier aircraft, Cosmic Girl, with a mock-up of its Launcher 1 rocket attached to the plane's left wing. Those taxi tests suggest the first captive carry flight of the system, where the rocket remains attached to the plane, will begin shortly. in a series of captive carry flights culminating in a drop test of the rocket, are planned before the first Launcher 1 mission expected late this year or early next year. And that's it for this week's Space News. Thank you once again, gentlemen, and it's back to you, Andrew.